this guy. I kept stumbling across this guy in the woods, so to speak, who himself was stumbling around in the woods as a 22-year-old in what's now Western Pennsylvania, and getting into all sorts of trouble in the wilderness and all sorts of extreme situations, and making all sorts of mistakes, like inadvertently setting off the French and Indian War, or setting the spark that set it off. And here's this guy, George Washington. And I was just amazed by this story. I didn't know anything about it. You know, of course, it's not the side of George Washington we hear about in our history, in our kind of national mythology. And so I became very engaged in that, in George in that period. And I wrote this book, Last Empty Places. So that was just one story among many in that book. And then some years later, I was, the idea came back to me. You know, here's a guy in an extreme situation in the wilderness, and it's so much not the guy we know as our founding father. And I became really interested in how how the wilderness had transformed him from this, you know, quite immature, very ambitious, thin-skinned, you know, almost whiny, needy guy that he'd been, to this, you know, incredible leader, which he did become eventually, you know, over many decades, really. And so how did that happen? And so that's the genesis for this book, Young Washington.
One of the interesting things that you do in the book is really go into the physicality of Washington. I mean, Washington is a physical person. I was thinking today before talking to you, I was thinking, well, Washington's physicality is almost like Jefferson's philosophy. Like, you can't take Jefferson's philosophy away from him any more than you can take the importance of Washington physically, especially as a young man. That has a lot to do. And kind of one of the things that makes me laugh a lot is I've gotten to know a number of people who do historical presentations, and some are very good and really are actors, and some are just fat guys in Philly who want to be Benjamin Franklin. And it's really funny to see the people who think they're George Washington, because some of them are these little short fat guys and they're walking around as George Washington. And you realize it's almost like, does John Kennedy get elected without hair? Does George Washington become George Washington if he isn't this strapping 6-foot strong man?
Well, that's exactly right. That he was such a physical being from a very early age. I mean, for his entire life. And that's what really carried him through his early career in a lot of ways. And it served him very well in his entire life. And I actually think that was the realm in which he was most comfortable, was that really physical realm. And that, you know, he was not really a very graceful social conversationalist, and he was not kind of an easy dinner party guest or host. But he was really a natural guy as a horseback rider in the woods, utterly fearless when it came to battle. And that, I think that created his image as much as anything else. I think it was Joe Ellis has a quote that I thought I heard him repeat, but something to the effect that, you know, Franklin was an inventor and Jefferson was a philosopher and Washington was a stud. And, you know, that's really his image. And he was very impressive. He was over 6 feet. And that he used that as he grew older to his advantage. But when he was younger, it's also what launched his career, that literally that physicality. And it's also what got him in a whole lot of trouble in that period.
You know, one of the things everyone knows about Washington is that stud period, which is why many people aren't particularly interested in Washington. They think of this guy who's just too perfect. And so you take this period of time and you say in the beginning that this George Washington that you write about is very different from the one that we hold sacred. And so whereas people think that he was born this way, you know, there's the quote from Hawthorne, he was born with his hair powdered and a wig and he bowed, you know, upon his entrance into the world. You're taking this period that shows how he creates this personality of George Washington. And you say right in the beginning, this guy I'm going to deal with at 21 is not the George Washington you know.
Not at all. Not at all. He's a floundering young man who's making, you know, the mistakes that we all make, and has the, you know, all the human foibles that we all have in our own way. I mean, I think the remarkable thing is that the journey that he took from that point to where he ended up, that there are so many aspects of that young man that end up sort of revealing themselves later in life, that so many of what we perceive as weaknesses in this early phase, he managed to turn into strengths. And that's one of the things that I find really interesting in the story.
And one thing you write about, which we'll go into, but one thing that really marks him out, even at that age, if you're looking back and you're saying, well, what makes him different from other people? I always notice that the people who become the truly great figures, they can screw up terribly and keep going. Churchill might do something and 5,000 people died, and whereas you and I would say, well, that's it, I'm going to go home. He's like, oh, well.
That is so true.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, most people would have given it up a long time, before he did, because I mean, that's so true, as you put it, that he just kept going. I mean, there's a certain almost relentlessness to him that he won't stop trying to get where he wants to go. And it's not, I don't think it's entirely clear where he wants to go, but it's up is what he wants to do. And he just doesn't stop. And he was, from a very early age, showed this a conscientiousness and this a willingness to learn. And, you know, one of the classic examples is the you know it and you've seen it, the 101 rules for gentlemanly and civil behavior, which he writes out by hand when he's in his early teens. And these are rules about how to behave in public. And then shortly thereafter, he taught himself to survey using his deceased father's surveying instruments. And that was largely a self-taught task, at least at the beginning. And so he had this ability to really kind of study what he needed to know. And, and at the same time, and especially in these wilderness experiences in his early 20s that I write about, that's what I really focus on, those 5 years in his early 20s in the Ohio Valley wilderness during the French and Indian War. During those 5 years, I mean, he made lots of mistakes. I mean, he put himself in situations where he never should have been, and really unwittingly got himself in way over his head on a number of occasions. But that he managed to figure it out, even though he almost died and had, there were terrible massacres that resulted from some of his actions. And terrible diplomatic catastrophes. But he managed to really almost study what he needed to do to keep going. And I think that was his real art. And he was never, he was never an academic. He didn't have more than probably what we'd call a middle school education, whereas his older brothers had been sent to boarding school in England and were very polished and had an education. He was, kind of a middle school education. But his genius was that he knew what he had to figure out. He knew how to go about learning something. And that carried through his whole life.
To go back a little bit, you talk about his brother's education versus his education. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that his father's death has on him and on his future as he sees it back when he's 11 years old and his dad dies?
I'll even back up a little farther than that.
Great.
And one of the things that I like to point out, and I do point out in my book and in one of the earlier chapters, is that, you know, to really understand where George Washington was coming from and this like fierce ambition that he had, it's really helpful to go way back before his time and look at his family. And the Washington family, you know, first in England and then in America, had for literally hundreds of years been striving to get up to the top of the aristocracy, but with, you know, amazing consistency, they had not made it. And there's this pattern that's really remarkable, having been digging around in their family history for quite a long time, is that the Washington males, first in England and then in America, tended to marry wealthy and landed widows, and that would bring them up higher in society. And then they'd have about 17 children, and the wealth would disperse, and down they'd go again, and you know, the cycle would begin. And so the first Washington that came to this continent was a guy I called John the Sailor Washington, who was sort of a refugee from the English Civil War and got involved in a trading journey and came over here, landed in Virginia, ended up being on a ship that ended up sinking in an ice storm in the Potomac, ruining the cargo of tobacco. The captain said, you know, you're an investor in this, you owe me a whole lot of money for this ruined tobacco cargo. And John the Sailor didn't have the money. The case went to court. The magistrate in Virginia, a guy named Pope, was a planter, took a shine to young Washington, John the Sailor, introduced young Washington to his daughter. The two got married, and the old man gave young Washington 700 acres of plantation land, you know, the young couple. And so that's what really launched the Washingtons in Virginia, on this continent. And that was George's great grandfather. And so the Washingtons had been, you know, more of a middling class of planters ever since, that they had been in that, you know, that upper crust Virginia aristocracy with the massive plantations and the thousands of acres and the hundreds of slaves. They were, you know, much more, you wouldn't call them middle class, but they weren't that. And so by the time George came along, you know, that they were doing fairly well. The family was doing fairly well. But then his father, Gus, died when George was 11. I think I've got my dates right. And George had two older half brothers from an earlier marriage of Gus's, and Gus had sent those half brothers, among them Lawrence, who was the eldest and who was George's big hero, to England, to boarding school. And so they had these, as I was saying, these polished English manners and polished, you know, British education. And Gus died before George was sent off to that. And so here's George, 11 years old, Gus dies. And George does not have polished British manners, you know, of a British gentleman. He does not have much of an education. Gus leaves most of his land to the older brothers, and George has a, you know, small bit of land, but not really enough to support him. And so how's this guy going to make a living? You know, there's George in his early teens, and, you know, you got to make a living somehow. And so there was talk about George going to sea as a sailor, and his mom immediately put the kibosh on that after hearing from her brother how poorly sailors were treated at sea. And so at 14, that's when George literally picked up his father's surveying instruments. His father had done some surveying and taught himself to survey. And that's was the, the beginning of this arc that he took. And at the same time, I think this is a very significant sort of moment, that his, or period of years, long moment, but when his older brother Lawrence married into the Fairfax family, who was they were true British peers. And you know, a few generations earlier, the British king had given them 5 million acres of Virginia land. And I did the math on that, and thinking, we could calculate things in terms of our half-acre lawns or whatever. Well, so 5 million acres is 90 miles by 90 miles, a lawn that big. That was their holdings. And so Lawrence married into that family. And at the same time, George was learning to survey. So one of his first survey exercises is like surveying Lawrence's cabbage patch at Mount Vernon. And then he gets connected through Lawrence to the Fairfax family, and the Fairfax family is sending a big surveying expedition into the like the backcountry, as they call it, but the wilderness lands on the edge of the mountains. And George is invited along as a young kind of a learning surveyor, and that's what gives him his first real taste of wilderness, and brings him close to the Fairfax family, and launches him as a young freelance surveyor.
You even go before that, which I found really interesting and useful, when you just talk about the Virginia that George Washington's growing up in, and how he grows up in it, in terms of the fact that tobacco comes out here, makes Virginia a very different colony from someplace like Massachusetts, in terms of you start getting this somewhat of a recreation of the British caste system over here in Virginia, which becomes part of what George Washington is growing up in.
Very much so, very much so. And that the Virginia planters, because tobacco was such an intensive, a crop that required such intensive labor, and was also very profitable. That's how basically slaves started to be imported, is to work these fields, which required huge amounts of labor. And then you start getting more and more of a hierarchical class system, which is, in some ways adapted from England. And these planters, as they became wealthier, actually a lot of it when they were doing on credit, but they were living these lavish lifestyles, and that in a way were imitations of an English country gentleman. And so every man was, master of his own fate, his own estate. He was independent. He was reliant on no one. I mean, every man, that's meaning every free white male in this case, and or every free white male who had a lot of land. We should put it that way. Yeah. And so that very hierarchical system elaborated as time went on. And at the same time, I think this is a key element that was a surprise to me, and I've been learning actually more about it since I wrote Young Washington on further research I'm doing for my next book. But the tobacco is notorious for exhausting the soil, that you cannot grow tobacco well, profitably, for very many years in the same place. So these Virginia planters always were desperately needing more land. They always needed more land to expand their holdings. And, for a long time, there was a lot of land, they kept moving west. And that it's so clear that when you have a Virginian who comes out of that planting culture, they are absolutely obsessive about acquiring land. They are all about land. And so when the whole first the British colonies and then what became the United States started pushing farther to the west, the Virginians were right there on the forefront looking for all the land they could embrace. And George Washington, starting at age 18, was when he acquired his first piece of land in the Shenandoah Valley. And he never stopped. I think he died with something like 30,000 acres of land over the mountains.
And those mountains, of course, are kind of they're as far as you can go safely, where you know everything that's going on, and then beyond it, it's almost like when we watch Star Trek. I mean, you're going off into this part of the world that you don't know what is beyond those mountains, right?
It's a total unknown, and it especially was when George was a young man and went on his first mission over the mountains sent by Governor Dinwiddie. There were very few reports that had come back from there, at least on the British side of things. There were very few maps, very few accurate maps. The French actually had better maps than the British did, because the French had, the Jesuits and then the fur trade coming down the Mississippi River and to some degree the Ohio and certainly the Great Lakes. So the French had a better grip on that world over there, and it was a whole separate world beyond the mountains. And George was, in this period of his life, he was a guy who moved between those two worlds, and he moved back and forth a lot. And I remember that I think I initially read this somewhere, and it seems so true, and I brought it into my book, but that's the same pattern that Joseph Campbell identified in the hero's journey. The hero moves between these two very different worlds, and the hero brings back, the news or information or the stories from this distant unknown alien world. And that was George, very much what George did in this period of his life. And he'd go on these forays into the wilderness, and I can so picture him in my mind, and there are accounts of this to a certain degree in surviving documents and letters. But George coming back out of the wilderness, and I'm pretty sure his first stop was Belvoir, the Fairfax estate on the Potomac River, which was just downstream from Mount Vernon, where his brother initially was, and then he was living there. But I think he'd stop, maybe even glancingly, at Mount Vernon. He certainly would go to the Belvoir, the Fairfaxes, before he'd go to his mom's house down on the down south, and that he would have these stories, these incredible stories of his adventures in the wilderness. And I think he absolutely wowed the audiences at the Fairfax house, among them the beautiful, charming Sally Fairfax, who he was obsessed with, even though she was married to his good buddy, George William Fairfax. And I think he had tremendous reinforcement in that, moving between that known world of the Virginia planter aristocracy and the unknown world of what lay over the mountains. And that when he came back from those forays, he had, a captive audience who looked up to him with great adulation. And I don't think he ever let that go. I think that's sort of the channel he started flowing with as this time period went on.
You talk about the difficulty he has. On the one hand, he's got the Fairfaxes, and he's got his friend George, who, you say basically encompasses everything he wants, up to and including his wife, when we get to that point. And yet he's with Mary Ball Washington, his mother, who has a very different kind of philosophy of life. And what can you tell us about his mother?
Well, that there's really not very much surviving about his mother, and but it's like a really interesting relationship and kind of a confounding one because it seems so strained and distant. And I think there's Mary Ball Washington has got more attention in recent years from scholars, so I think they're coming up with new information on her. But she, and maybe she's becoming a little more rounded and human in her portrayal. But she was certainly a mom who was demanding of her eldest son, and that she'd send him letters, requesting this and that and this and that from him. And I think that there was a real push on her part to have George stay home and take care of the family farm. And how can you blame her that she's been widowed? She's in her 20s, and she has several small children. And I think she's 20, maybe she's about 30. Several small children, living on a small plantation, a farm really, and she has to manage it herself. And there's George gallivanting around in the woods, and why isn't he back here helping out with the family? And you can also see it from George's perspective. It's like, you go back there and here I am, I'm a slave to the family farm. He's kind of seeing the bright lights of the Fairfax's Belvoir Manor rather than the down home style of life at Ferry Farm where his mom is. So that relationship is just a strange, distant, seemingly cold one. And I've read hundreds of George's letters and everything else from this period. And, it's clear that when he was on these various missions up and down to Williamsburg, coming out of the mountains and riding down to the capital at Williamsburg, he would almost ride right past his mom's house and he wasn't stopping. And, it was like pretty clear that George was not hanging with mom.
Yeah, you write about the one time when he has to travel all the way back, and he switches horses over at Belvoir, goes right by where his mother is.
Mom's house. I mean, so it's like this was not a warm and fuzzy relationship.
No. I think the problem is everyone who tries to study it ends up thinking about their own mother. So it's impossible to write anything impartially.
It's laden. There's a lot of baggage. Everybody brings their own baggage to it.
So here's George Washington. He's 21 years old, and Dinwiddie finds out that there are these that the French seem to be putting up a fort out west in an area that Dinwiddie actually has an economic interest in himself. And obviously this is laden with implications and possibilities of war. You have kind of the Cold War between England and France at the time, but a pretty touchy situation. How on earth does he end up choosing to send out this 21-year-old uneducated individual who's got no experience to bring this letter out and confront the French?
I think the stud factor played into that one. I mean, literally, that George, was this young, strapping guy who was very capable in the outdoors, and carried himself well, and he had done the surveying on the edge of the wilderness. It was really kind of the frontier lands in the Shenandoah Valley and the near valleys. So it wasn't quite like the deep what we call the deep wilderness. I mean, of course, there were Indian tribes back there where it's not wilderness at all; it's home. But compared to the so-called front country of the Virginia plantation country, this area where he had spent quite a lot of time as a surveyor in his late teens was kind of the world in between. And so he had experience in that, kind of at the edge of the wilderness. He knew how to travel in those situations. And he was, as I was saying, this young strapping guy who carried himself well. And he was his younger brother of Lawrence, who Dinwiddie Governor Dinwiddie knew well and respected, and Lawrence had just died or was about to die at that point. And George, when Governor Dinwiddie needed a messenger to carry a message from the governor in Williamsburg, over the mountains into the Ohio Valley, into what we'd call the wilderness, to deliver it to the French who are, rummaging around in the woods, apparently. George stepped forward, and George really presented himself to Governor Dinwiddie and said, "I can do this," in so many words. And the governor, took him on. The mission, that first one, it wasn't quite as fraught as the second one, because the first one was just basically delivering the message and coming back with the answer as soon as possible. And I don't think Governor Dinwiddie probably didn't have a lot of other options. Who was he going to send? I mean, who did he have nearby in that moment who had some wilderness experience, who had kind of the lineage, the bearing of a gentleman, which George did to a degree, and who was eager to just drop everything. George didn't have a lot going at that point, just eager to, get on the horse and ride in the winter over the mountains. And, you got to be kind of nuts to take that one on, but he did. George did.
And one of the most gripping parts of the book is his return, which is a real adventure, as he tries to come back, and they meet up with a Native American, and they have to create the raft. Can you talk a little bit about that, because that is
I love telling that story. You're gonna have to shut me up. But yeah, George came within about that close of dying several times, and I mean, it's just amazing that he survived. And so Governor Dinwiddie sends him over the Appalachian Mountains with this message for the French, and George leaves Williamsburg in, I think, late October, and he gets a guide in Christopher Gist, and has some actually servants along too, and they ride horses over the mountains. Early winter snowstorms slam them in the mountains, so they're riding and camping in snow. And if you've ever camped in snow, it's not a really pleasant experience. And then they get deeper and deeper into the wilderness, and the winter starts getting worse and worse. They finally get way back there. They get to a little French outpost, and George goes up and tries to deliver this letter to the French commanding officer there, and the guy says, "Oh man, you're in the wrong place. You got to ride another week that way." And so George and his guys ride another week way up. By now they're almost up to Lake Erie, and there's a elderly French officer, professional officer, who receives them very well, and treats them to all the best hospitality, and the dinners, and probably I know they have red wine brought in from France and Montreal, and then sends off George with this letter, a reply to Governor Dinwiddie. And Governor Dinwiddie has ordered George to come back with all possible haste. And George takes this mission and the haste part of it extremely seriously. Obviously wanting to make a good name for himself, and he's an eager and strong young man. And so they set off, and as they set off, the snows start falling deeper. It gets colder. They eventually, their horses are weakening because the horses can't paw through the snow to get forage underneath the snow, and they can't break the ice to get on little creeks to get water. And at this point, George says to the very experienced wilderness guide, Christopher Gist, "Well, let's leave the horses and we go through we'll walk." And Christopher Gist, the guide, this is one of my favorite parts, and I've studied these journals very intimately, and so I line by line, because Christopher Gist has a journal that runs parallel to George Washington's journal, and Christopher Gist is like, he's, literally saying in his journal, I wasn't sure a Virginia gentleman could walk. Obviously Virginia gentlemen don't walk, they ride horses. And so, Gist is really skeptical about this idea, but young Washington, 21 at this point, just pushes him, and obviously very hard, because Gist finally gives in. And then they walk for a little while, and it's cold and it's snowy, and they're following these winding Indian trails through the wilderness. And George says, wow, this is like taking way too long, and we're winding all over the place. Why don't we just take a shortcut, leave these trails and take a shortcut through the woods? And, this meaning many, many miles shortcut. And, and George has all this confidence. I mean, it's classic neophyte mistakes in the wilderness. And, I've done it myself. I've seen many other people go through this exact same kind of thing. And so just thinking, you can overcome, you're young and strong, and you can overcome this. It's not a problem. And so, George has a compass, and, is a survey guy, and I was making maps as they go. And he said, well, let's take this compass bearing and go. And so they do. And they eventually meet an Indian guide, or not an Indian guide. They meet an Indian who it seems wants to help them, and then it's not clear if he wants to help them. And then it appears that he just took a shot at one of them. And this is at night in the woods. It's probably around 0 degrees. It's snowy. They're in moonlight or starlight, and they begin to think that they're being chased by Indians, and that they're going to be, run down and scalped. And so George and Christopher Gist literally take off running, and they run. I did the numbers on this. They run almost 40 hours straight through the woods, and it's really cold and snowy, and it's just exhausting. I mean, this is one like an ultra marathon. They finally get to a frozen a river, which we now know as the Allegheny, and they think, because it's so cold, the river will be frozen, and they can just walk across the ice to the other side. Well, they get to the river, and it's not frozen. The edges are frozen, but the center is running very swiftly with big flows of ice coming down. And so Christopher Gist said, well, our only hope is to make a raft. So they spend all day making a raft with a one dull little hatchet, because George has left they had to leave all the good equipment back with the horses, the big axes. And so they make this raft, and at dusk, they shove it off the ice shelf into the river. And George is clearly thinking, here I am, this strong young man in the wilderness, and I can just, muscle my way through. And he leaves a very actual detailed description of just what happens, but he's pulling with a big pole, shoving the raft along the bottom, and the raft gets hit by an ice flow, which is, I've been in this situation before too. This is really powerful. These forces they're inhumanly powerful. There's no way you're going to stop anything. So, but George is trying to force the raft, but the ice flow forces the raft into his pole, and it springs it like a catapult, and George gets launched into the river, the fast flowing Allegheny with all these ice flows. And I think we came within about 1 inch of losing our founding father right there, because that is a really dangerous situation. And he did manage to pull himself out, but that was only the beginning of it, because if you've been in water that cold, once, you can only last a minute or two in there before you just start freezing up and sinking. And two, you're so cold when you get out, you cannot function. And so what they do is they manage to get the raft to an island, a snowy island in the river. But there's the problems really begin if anybody has been in this situation, because how are you going to survive all night long on a frozen island, probably 0 degrees, and you're soaking wet? And George is probably, I would suspect, his clothes. I'm sure his clothes are freezing up. I'm sure he couldn't move his fingers. And I think it was completely Christopher Gist who saved him right in that moment, and who got a fire going. they survived the night on this island. And George later wrote in his journal, well, Mr. Gist had all his fingers and toes frozen. And I'm sure Mr. Gist had all his fingers and toes frozen because he was the guy starting the fire while George was, huddling, just trying to stay warm and alive. And Gist had to take off his gloves and work with his hands, and that was a problem. So that was the kind of humbling experience that George underwent in the wilderness as this young man. And I always like to think about that raft incident when he gets thrown into the river and almost dies, of hypothermia, as really having, I like to think, of course it's speculation, but a bearing much later in his life and on our nation's history, when he realizes that he can actually use the cold and winter as an ally in his battle against the British. And he figures out he can cross the Delaware on this cold, icy, frozen night, and that the British are not going to suspect that somebody would do something like that, and knows how to do it, and he understands the forces that he's dealing with, and he uses them to his advantage. And so I really like to see that line of how a nearly fatal mistake in the wilderness when he was a young man possibly ended up serving him very well, and us very well, in the Revolution.
Another thing I noticed that just to jump ahead just for a moment, because you brought that up, that seems to me that could have really impacted him was when you have these, and people argue about how many of these Indian attacks there were when he's over in Winchester, but you have these attacks and withdraw, attacks, withdraw, which is really what he does prior, again, to crossing the Delaware every day. The story is that, everyone was drinking and was drunk because of Christmas, which of course isn't true. They were being attacked almost every day, just these little kind of guerrilla warfare attacks that Washington was sending over, which means you just can't, you can't rest. You can't really sleep because you don't know when these little attacks are happening, which is the situation that he has when he needs to take care at Winchester, and you keep having these attacks happen down the line.
Yeah, I was losing you a little bit in the middle there, but can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Oh, was I freezing? It does that every now and then. No, I was just talking about before crossing the Delaware.
No, I think I heard your question.
Yeah.
I think I got your question. That being under the constant threat of Indian attack in his younger years in the wilderness in the French and Indian War was really a great preparatory lesson for George in the Revolution, because knowing that you had to be on your guard, you had to be ready all the time, and you also had to expect things to happen from directions, both figuratively and literally, directions you didn't expect. And that, in those wilderness situations which he was in, especially when you're in a situation where there you've got a possibly hostile enemy out there, whether they're Indians or French or whomever, you're just on your alert all the time. And I think that served him very well as he came into leadership in the Revolution.
So let's talk a little bit about this battle that's going to really start the war, when George Washington is going to order fire, and you're going to have the first actual tussle between people that's going to lead to this 7 years war. So of course, Washington's going to order his men to fire upon the French who are having breakfast out around the Fort Necessity area. And a lot of people claim that these French were just diplomats and weren't doing anything wrong. And you write about Washington's decision and whether he would have made the same kind of decision later on as a more mature person.
Yes, that there is a lot of debate historically, and there are more details being uncovered all the time about this moment when he essentially ambushes this French party in a wooded glen in the Ohio wilderness. And did the French make some move first and tried to fire on him first? That was his argument. Did he fire the first shot? Did he give the orders to fire the shot? Just what unfolded. Almost regardless exactly how it unfolded in that moment, it was really a mistake, and a terrible diplomatic mistake, simply to approach the way he approached this French party, whether they were hostile, which they obviously were not overtly hostile, but whether they were a military party or a diplomatic party. Why would you come sneaking over a rocky crown of a glen in the early morning, just after dawn, after a rainy night, with 40 guys who had their muskets loaded at the ready? Why didn't you just simply send a couple of guys in with a flag, or to make some diplomatic approach to see what these French guys were up to? I mean, why just like open fire? And so that's the part that seemed to me a profound mistake, is that he just took the entirely wrong approach to this party to begin with.
And then down the line from that, you're going to have one of my favorite places in the world, Fort Necessity, which I love as a great symbol about how badly you can screw up and still become president, or still do well. Which is just, I guess this is right around the area where you've done a lot of hiking and so forth. But you can go there today, and you just look at, of course, it's a rebuilt fort, but you just look at the surrounding area, and you think, how on earth could he think it was a good idea to build a fort around hills where you could so easily be surrounded?
Yeah, if I so recommend a visit to Fort Necessity for anyone who is interested in this period of history, because, as you say, it's just a revelation what this little claptrap thing is in a kind of a marshy meadow surrounded by woody hills. And that, as you say, it's a metaphor for how you can make some really major mistakes in your life and come back from them, which he did, more than once. But this was certainly a prime example. It's so tiny. It's 50 feet in diameter. I mean, that's not even the size of a front lawn. And he built this thing, and he said, he wrote a letter to Governor Dinwiddie saying, I've built a fort that can withstand the attack of 500 men. That's how, cocky and confident he was. Well, wrong. Didn't work at all. And as we all know, it was this terrible slaughter, as the French and Indians, instead of marching straight down the meadow to confront George's troops lined up outside the fort, the French and Indians scattered up into the woods, and George and his guys couldn't even see them to take a shot at them. And but I do like to point to that Fort Necessity as what I think of one of the pivotal moments in his life. And that, Jumonville Glen was one thing. Fort Necessity was, in a way, something different, because I think maybe one of his guys was wounded or died at Jumonville Glen. Fort Necessity was a whole different scale. And that here he is as the darkness is falling that evening, and the French and the Indians have just been, raining musket balls down on them. And the George and his men are just trying to, see a guy to shoot back and to try to hit somebody up there on the hill. And that his guys are just dying, and it's raining. And they're in this swampy meadow, and they're in these trenches, and there are eyewitness descriptions by survivors who talk about how the trenches are filling up with mud and blood. And, there are guys lying in these trenches, wounded and dead. And I have that in my mind, in my, interpretation of these pivotal moments of George's life, as this moment where he sees his fallen soldiers, his comrades. And these are guys, some of them he knows from, probably growing up there. He's been with them for the last some weeks, so he obviously knows them quite well. And now there they are, face down in the mud and blood, and facing up into the rain, but they're dead and they're wounded, and a lot of them are dead. And George, has to have undergone this realization that, it was my decisions led to this, this outcome. And that's really one of the first moments that I see where that his focus begins to shift off of himself, and it begins to shift more towards those around him, initially towards his soldiers and his officers, and then it starts expanding outward from there to eventually to the frontier settlers whom he has to defend later in the war. And over the many decades, he becomes this guy who, rather than being so self-centered, so self-focused, this leader who, though he's not without an ego by any means, he becomes this leader, though, who's constantly working towards the greater good and constantly wants to promote the greater good. And that here at Fort Necessity, I think that was one of the moments where that thinking, that empathy, that thinking about the greater good began for George Washington.
And of course, while they're waiting there, they think they're all going to die, and they break into the I guess the brandy. They find the brandy cask, and it's really a moment, if you have an imagination, to think of him sitting there with everyone either shot or bleeding or drunk, and thinking, this is probably the end of the line for me. As soon as it gets light, they're going to kill us all. Then of course he signs the document.
and then sort of this. Well, the amazing thing happens is that the French are running out of ammunition, as it turns out, which he has no idea, and I think they're having their own struggles with damp powder and everything else, and I think they probably feel like, well, we've made our point about George should not have attacked our diplomatic party. This is we've made our point, and so they come down with the white flag, or a flag to have a discussion and offer the surrender terms to George. And he doesn't have a whole lot of choice, and he signs them. And it's, of course, the infamous language that in which he, by signing this document in French, the language says that he admits that he assassinated this officer.
Yeah, and I love the quote.
And from there, the French and Indian War really gets rolling.
Yeah, you've got that great quote where the individual, I forget who says the quote, but kind of defending Washington, talks about how easier these things are over the bottle than when you're actually in the place. And it's one of the things you see whenever the historians are writing about the battles. Everything's so much clearer. And what you make clear in your book by going to both sides is how much confusion there really is, because, time and time again, the French are feeling just about as hopeless as the British.
That's right. Yeah, you see that they have their own struggles as they're going along. It's not all easy for the French by any means.
Yeah, but sometimes I tell people
the Indian warriors are the ones who seem to manage so well in the woods. That's what's so striking to me, is that those guys were so tough. Those Indian warriors, and when the, you know, and they didn't kind of put themselves in the situation where they ran into the same problems that the French or British or later the Americans would, that they, you know, typically if the Indian warriors saw that if their leaders saw that they weren't going to win a battle, they you know, left before real losses occur. And they never bothered trying to hold a piece of land like a hill, you know, that the way in Western warfare, it's like, oh, it's all about holding the hill or taking the hill or whatever. It's like the Indians, it's like, oh, why bother, man? There are hills everywhere. Go to a different hill. And so you can have that hill. We'll go to a different one. And so there was that, the, you know, you say about how the French had their struggles and the British and, you know, Virginians had their struggles in the wilderness. And when I, you know, read these accounts, it always seems to me that the Indians are the ones who are struggling the least. Of course, in the long run, that's not true, of course. But that's another one of these aspects that I think really carried over much later in George's career. That, and, you know, I have to say that this is out of my area of expertise because I really know this 5 years of his life and less about the Revolutionary War. But in the Revolutionary War, in my understanding of it, one of his greatest strengths was that George would not engage the enemy if he didn't think he had a good, at least later in the war, if he didn't think he had a good chance, and he did not want to hold terrain as much as keeping moving and avoiding, making the British come after him, and in a way exhausting them from having to pursue him. And that was very much an Indian strategy, that why fight if you're going to lose? You know, why fight a battle if you think you might lose it? And make your enemy work as hard as possible to fight you. And so these are things that I think really played out in the Revolutionary War that George first saw in the French and Indian War.
Of course, you're going to have the great battle he's going to have on the side of Braddock, and you really describe, as you're leading up to this battle, Braddock and the other Englishmen having no respect for the Indian fighters, you know, telling Benjamin Franklin that British aren't going to have to worry about the Indians. And you've got George Washington, who's seen what the Indians can do, and you know, going into this battle, and the British feeling so strong beforehand. And I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite parts of your book is when you discuss Braddock's background and what Braddock was thinking as he's ordering these British to march forward. Once, you know, you see that the Indians and the French have started to hide behind trees and fire at them from the sides.
Yeah, I did try to see it from Braddock's point of view. And, you know, here you have a guy who's sort of the embodiment of the British Empire in some ways, that you know, he came from a family with quite a long military lineage, and some of his family were close to the royal family as kind of staff. But his background in, you know, he was in the elite units of the British military or the Royal Army, but he had never seen real combat before himself, and that he was more of a logistical supply officer. And for a while he was in charge of Gibraltar and all the supplies having to do with Gibraltar, and that entailed dealing with a lot of different cultures, which he had, I guess, shown a certain knack for. And yet then he is leading this, you know, this whatever, close to 2,000 redcoats into the wilderness, you know, chopping a road like 125 miles long. Got a 250 frontier axemen out in front chopping their way. And that there must have been such a feeling of power of, this is what we have. Here's the British Empire thrusting itself into the wilderness, and and they had cannons, and they had all enormous supply train, and then all of a sudden they're ambushed by this force of French and Indians, and here's all the glory of the British Empire, and they had just crossed a river. They had just crossed the Monongahela River. And Braddock had ordered them to cross with all their colors flying. And so they were in all their full regalia. And when all of a sudden out of the, from the woods, not even out of the woods, they couldn't see it, this ambush begins. Mm-hmm. And so Braddock, if you think of where he was, that, this is the moment that he has been trained for his entire life, and is leading up to this moment, and where he's confronting the enemy on the battlefield. He has all the might of the British Empire, all the resources you can imagine. And yet his guys are getting mowed down just brutally in the middle of the road they've chopped. And they won't even stand in formation to go marching up Indians up in the woods. They won't hold formation to, their firing platoons. And his whole life is, in so many ways, riding on the line. His reputation, everything is on the line here. The British Empire reputation on the line here. And he can't get these guys to do what he wants. Nothing's going right. Everything is just complete disaster. And it just must have been a utter shock to Braddock in that moment. And, he was doing things and reportedly hitting these soldiers with the back of his sword to try to, calling them cowards, to try to get them up and fight. So it was a really revelatory moment for Braddock in the brief moments he was alive to see it.
And of course, Washington keeps having this hope. Well, he's got a couple big hopes. One is he wants the British to acknowledge him, so that he's not just a Virginia fighter, but he's part of the British military, which never happens. And the other thing he wants is to be there on that final battle to retake Fort Duquesne. And so, of course, they're marching out there. And if you can kind of describe what happens with Washington when he gets up to that point where he believes this triumphal battle is going to happen.
Yeah, that's kind of it's almost like the inverse of the Braddock March, that General Forbes, who was a very accomplished and smart general, now leading another big column of redcoats into the wilderness, and much more careful about building supply camps, and they gradually approach the epicenter of French operations in the wilderness, Fort Duquesne, at the forks of the Ohio. And first they have a number of, skirmishes and small battles, but they're gearing up for the big moment. And, and Washington is going to be in charge of, I think he's got the whole Virginia regiment or part of it. He's going to be in charge of all these guys, and everything's looking like glory in battle. And then there's a distant explosion, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. Well, when they finally get to the fort, the French have blown it up, set it on fire, and abandoned it. And so this great moment of glory never occurs. Washington, I think few people really realize this denouement to his wilderness career. That if I have my dates right, that was late November of 1758, and they get to the Fort Duquesne. All of Forbes' troops and Washington's guys, they get to Fort Duquesne, and within about, I think it's 10 days, Washington, this is in letters, says to Forbes, well, my men, they're going to be here for the winter. I need to get them more, they're running out, they need more clothes and blankets and, supplies. And so I'm going to go out and, rustle up some more supplies. And so George rides out, now this is early December, 1758, goes back over the mountains, and he never comes back. And he's, within 3 weeks, I believe he's has resigned from the military. Within a month or so, he's married Martha, who's the wealthiest widow in Virginia, who has 17,000 acres of land. And he's, his career is over. His French and Indian War military career is over. It just, done. And so it's such a strange ending to this, kind of crazy, ambitious period of his life. And it's almost like he just walks away from it. It's like gone. And he still has the respect of his officers. I mean, his men generally like him a lot, and his officers, but he just, he rides out of the woods and never comes back. And so it's a very strange scene.
What's so interesting about the book and about that period of life is, it gets to that point, he moves on, and then the next time Washington's back on the world stage, he's a completely different person, which you don't see very much in history, where people really legitimately change to the degree George Washington does. And in your book, you've got, and one of the great things about your book is all of the quotations of his letter with sometimes the syntax is off. He's often very emotional, sometimes practically hysterical. It's just absolutely, as you said before, it's a George Washington we haven't seen, and it's a George Washington who just doesn't come back. And so,
well, and that's go ahead.
I was just going to say,
well, I mean, that's one of the
you don't. There's no such thing as failure if you learn from it. I've never seen anyone who clearly got so much from a period as he seems to have gotten from this period that you write about.
Yeah, I exactly. I mean, that in a way, for all the disaster, it was a very rich period for him, a very rich learning period. And as you say, there's I guess it's roughly 15 years, it's probably 20 years since he actually went into the wilderness before he's elected, chosen commander in chief of the Continental Army. 1775. Well, yeah, more than 20 years. He first goes into the wilderness in 1752, so that would be 23 years. And he comes out of the wilderness 1758. So in those intervening years between 1758 and 1775, what transformation does George undergo? Because he's gone from this, reckless ambition, ambitious, thin-skinned, whiny, he's kind of got beyond that in the French and Indian War, but this very different guy. And so what in those 15 years, what's gone on? And, he's become a landed gentry plantation owner in Virginia. And one of the points I like to make, and when I give a talk about this period, I really emphasize it, that I think a key is that when he did get out of the wilderness, he married Martha. And even though he was still infatuated with Sally Fairfax, clearly he'd written some letters just before the final battle that never occurred about, he wanted to know in so many words whether she loved him or not. But then he gets out of the woods and he marries Martha immediately. And I think Martha, and it was a very good marriage, a very warm one, a very supportive one. And I think Martha really grounded him, really settled him down, really said, George, it's okay. You don't have to try so hard. And gave him that sort of intimacy and closeness that he didn't have with his mother, with his father wasn't around, that he didn't, his great friend, older brother had died a long time ago. So he didn't really have that emotional intimacy, and Martha gave it to him. And I think a lot of reassurance that he didn't previously have. And I think it helped a huge amount that she had 17,000 acres of land and, I think at least 100 slaves, which, suddenly he's no longer like the middling aristocracy. He is it in Virginia. And so he doesn't have to worry about his status as a Virginia planter aristocrat. He's got it. And then, so I think that really grounds him in that period. And he was very, focused on planting and, being a farmer, and really liked it. And then as, well, the story, you know it better than I do, I'm sure, that as the British started raising taxes on the American colony, in large part to pay for this war that George was very much in from the beginning, that the colonists, or many of them, started really pushing back on the taxes, and George, you see that he's both trying to find a kind of solution to this, yet also he's after a while he's not going to take any shit from the British. It's almost like he's already been through that, and that in a very early letter, I think it's from 1768. So that's only 10 years after he came out of the wilderness. He was one of the first guys who says, if we have to, we'll take up arms against the British. I mean, that's revolutionary. And so, but he's not, he's not like really blustering around about it. He just says, okay, if we got to do it, we got to do it. And that's sort of you start sensing that part of him, that where he's been through all this stuff, and he's seen so much, and so much violence and trauma and chaos and uncertainty, that he really has a sense of it's almost like he's been fire hardened as a resilient survivor of all that, and can kind of hold the center. And then he's great at, this, of course, all those classic great anecdotes about how he shows up at the Continental Congress and he's wearing his home designed uniform, and he's really into uniforms. That, I've read he's in all these early letters, he's always looking for a silver lace whenever he goes traveling to a city. He wants to go buy some silver lace. And so he has this really nice uniform that he had designed for his county, I think his county militia. And then at the Continental Congress, he's the guy who has that bearing as a soldier. And, there's, the quotes in the letters about, who's it, John Adams, who said, well, not even a prince of Austria or whatever has the bearing of this guy, has this sort of regal bearing, and this sense of leadership and strength. And so there's George, 1775. One of the funny thing, and so people look to him for leadership because he has been through this. But they also think he's this, hero from the French and Indian War. Well, memories had dimmed by then. That was 20 years later. And after actually I finished the book and it was published, I came across a quote, and now I can't remember where it is. I have it marked somewhere, but it was someone either at the Continental Congress or in the neighborhood at that time, who said about George at the Continental Congress during this period, well, Mr. Washington is so modest. He never speaks about his earlier war experiences. And then you think, well, there's a lot that you wouldn't want to talk about, basically. So, so he knew he was very good at knowing when not to talk. He was great at silence. There's just what we were talking about, just what you brought up. He let his physique do the talking in this situation.
Yeah. Well, and I will let you go in a minute. I thank you so much for talking to me so long. But one point I really find interesting in your book, because what's fun about your book is he's so different, but every now and then you see a little something that tells you, that he's a special person. And one, it really occurred to me as I was reading it, uh, after he resigns the first time and Braddock takes over, he could have easily just not joined again. I mean, he'd gotten as much experience as Lawrence did. He could have parlayed that into the House of Burgesses. He's got his, you know, he really didn't need to go back and write that letter, which we don't have, but which we know he wrote. And that's a point where you say what Lawrence did is no longer good enough for him. He's got higher sights,
higher aspirations. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point about, you know, why didn't he just, you know, call it good right there? And, you know, he's like literally working at Mount Vernon, and, you know, there's the Royal Navy sailing up the Potomac in front of his house. And it's like, wait, I got to be part of this party. I mean, really, he couldn't resist it. He couldn't stand it. And that, you know, it speaks to his character in some way about how he really wanted to be at the center of things. And I think that comes through from an early age too, that he was just compelled to be at the center.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And again, you did a great job of bringing all of that forward in the book. You know, you did a great job of letting him talk for himself. And it's always funny when you look at books, and, you know, the problem every writer has is you want to tell a story and you get it in your head, and then you try to fit things into that story to make it come out. And it's just what we do, right? And you really allowed it to, I think, transform and just occur as it really did occur, because that's how life is. There never is a direct line to anything, you know? And so I love that, because at times it's like, okay, he's maturing, and then nope, he's back to,
it was not a straight line. Not a straight line. And that was one of the pleasures of the book was doing the research and finding, you know, all these tidbits and scraps, and, you know, reading his letters, which are just, some of them are, as you say, they're just pretty crazy. A lot of them are very just memos about logistics and soldiers and supply, a lot of them. But just kind of trying to live every little bit of that period of his life on the basis of the evidence that we have, and then also going and visiting many of these places myself, and, you know, paddling a bit on some of the rivers and camping on the top of some of the Appalachian mountains, and, you know, where these guys were out, and experiencing it as best I could, and then trying to bring it alive. It was really a great pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. And again, the book is Young Washington. You can get it at Amazon.com. You can get it when stores are open again. You could probably go into one and get it if we have them in the future again.
That's right. Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah, who knows? You know, who knows what the new normal is going to be? But we know Amazon.com will never die. Them and the roaches will be left after the rest of us.
Post-nuclear, yeah. Okay, well, David, thanks so much. I really enjoyed talking with you. Hope we meet in person someday, in one point or another, and, you know, one era or another.
I hope we do. And yeah, please let me know when you're in Philadelphia, and I would love to be around.
Well, yeah, we should. That'd be so great. My sister lives outside of Philadelphia, so
really?
We get out there for a month. Yeah, you know, way out near Chester Springs, way out that way.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I would love to see you. I'd love to show you around Philadelphia when you come.
Oh, God, I would be so engaged. I'd need to know way more about the details of Philadelphia.
Oh, I'm there. Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. Take it easy, man.
Bye.
Bye.